What we are facing now is a sort of imperial president or something like that, with almost 100% of power.
This South American mega continent is now going to be the plaything of those up north.
Now we know something about what is the thinking in Washington and how they see the Western Hemisphere. If you are not improving the quality of life of people, if you are not delivering, if you are not providing the opportunity to be a good citizen, whatever it means, hey, what is the role of politics?
When we talk about a new world order, it often sounds abstract, something distant, theoretical, exaggerated, something that feels wouldn't happen now. We talk about them in the past, changing the world in moments, not something that you think that you'd live through. But sometimes a single event does happen and it's impossible to ignore and impossible to go back. And this week, we have probably lived through that. The US military attack on Venezuela saw the capture of President Nicolás Maduro in a special prevention intervention. And it was simply not just about Venezuela. So today I'm going to be talking to Professor Juan Manfredi, who is going to talk to us and explain the emergence of a new world order and the 5 biggest lessons that these events have had on the world. But today, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Juan Manfredi. You're joining us from Spain. I hope the weather's a little bit nicer than it is over here in the UK.
It's terrible here right now in Madrid. It's very, very nice day, but it's very cold. So thanks for having me. And I don't know if we have 5 big ideas about how the international order is changing, or maybe 1, or maybe 10. What I know right now is that the 20 days ago, maybe 1 month ago, we used to be in one world, and now we are in a new and an amazing situation, having new conditions, new actors, and new consequences. Let's see.
Well, so part of the reason that I invited you on, and a lot of the basis of this discussion, but obviously I've done research to build upon this, was your magnificent article on the Conversation website, and the link will be in the description for people to follow along as well. But there were 5 main points on there, but we're going to expand upon that. And the first lesson that you kind of drew from what has gone on in the world is this showcasing the new, almost unlimited power of the US president, with the Supreme Court also ruling that the president can't do anything illegal. This moment shows us that there are new levels to a US president and the holder of that position. So, could you explain the significance of this in terms of world history? Have we ever been at this point before where a president basically has unlimited and almost unchecked power?
This is the first point, and probably the most important one. What we are facing now is a sort of imperial president or something like that, with almost 100% of power. In the last 50 years, America was trying to reduce presidential powers, increasing the capacity of the Congress, or trying to participate better in the policy making or decisions or whatever. But now, what we have with President Trump is a completely different doctrine. This doctrine means, okay, we have to expand presidential powers because we are facing an international crisis. We are facing international menace or crisis, whatever you want to say that. So we have to provide to the president extraordinary powers, extraordinary capacity. So it means that if you are in the middle of a war, and we can discuss this later, the president is not going to stop with, this chow chow of the parliamentary issues, the press, the science, the policy making. So I have to rule, and we have to start today. It's very interesting that in the American history, Trump considers himself, let's say, a new Washington, a new Lincoln, a new Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Do you know why? Because these big 3 presidents We're in the middle of an internal and domestic crisis, and they need more power. And nobody is asking today that Washington, Lincoln, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt were not, let's say, conventional presidents. They were very, very special one. And this is what Trump considers himself, a special one. Like, like this is the time for me, and I'm not here to stop. I'm not going to ask the press or the judiciary power if I have the capacity or not. I'm going to do that. That's what he keeps in mind.
I just want to open this out a little bit more because you say for years there's been a struggle to control the president, but you kind of look at the 20th century as a whole, and I would say that World War II, Roosevelt was fairly controlled, but then he passed through a lot of legislation so that he could have all these different agencies to be able to do things across the USA. Was it a kind of drip feed since then, moving from him later on to other presidents, and then basically until we get to Ronald Reagan, sorry. Was Reaganism maybe the beginning of this supernatural president that took on extraordinary roles? Or is it wrong to kind of think about that? Because was there other watershed moments maybe recently that actually saw this ability to allow the president off the chains and be able to do whatever they wish?
Probably, I will say that these extraordinary powers for the American president is not so new. So, indeed, it is part of the American tradition. If you check the history from the start of the American Revolution, there was this, let's say, debate about how far and how powerful has to be the president. President Trump is not right now telling us that he's connecting his presidency with this unitary executive theory, which means I have to expand the presidential power because we need to have a strong republic. If you go through this historical lens, this is again the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson. Do you want to have states? Do you want to have governors? Or do you want to have a strong republic? Do you want to have a strong president, a sort of king? Please remember the demonstrations in the last months. We don't want kings. It's the same conversation. Is again, if you have almost all the capacity, if you are not responsible of the consequences of your acts, if you don't have to pay any consequences on behalf of your because you are the president, hey, this is more similar to a king rather than I mean a traditional king rather than to a constitutional president. This is what we are facing now, trying to revamp this unitary executive theory, trying to revamp the hey, I'm here, I need to rule on things like tariffs, the frontiers, the fight against the cartels, the questions of the energy, the federal guard, everything, almost everything he has been touching is under this role, I would say role of command, if you don't mind, or role of president command, which is not so new in terms of tradition and history, but let's say it's more special because President Trump is trying to avoid any reaction or trying to flood any reaction coming from the press, coming from the internal Republican Party. Of course, if you check how the Democratic Party is right now is not doing very well. No good ideas, no good answers. It's not clear who is going to develop an answer, and that's fantastic for this Trumpian approach to presidential power.
To build upon that, how much resistance still exists inside US institutions to this growing executive power of the president? Because, we've seen attempts by the Supreme Court, by Congress, we've seen at least little moments here and there to try and stop the powers from growing. But it seems from the outside, I could be incorrect here, but it's too little too late. we've already lost that battle. Is there anything that people can be positive about, that maybe there is some power out there that can reel this in?
So I will say that, okay, under Trump administration, he's following this strategy, flood the zone. Every time, every day, I will say, maybe 2 times per day, we think that we are in the last mile, and then we have another last mile, and then we are going to cross again another last mile. So this flood the zone strategy means that you don't have time to develop a proper strategy or proper defensive strategy, because you are every time trying to answer about the Panama Channel, the Greenland issue, the question of Venezuela, the question of the migrants. Every day you have more and more and more information. This is part of the Trumpist administration strategy. So do we have a chance to do something of relevant to stop this development? I would say yes. I would say we still have the press, we still have the universities, and we are going to have elections in November where you will have 39 governors on the ground trying to say something different. Maybe you are going to have midterms elections where maybe Trump is not going to win. That's very interesting. Trump is an excellent candidate. He's going to achieve more than 70 million votes. But do you know what? All the followers, all these Trumpist candidates are not so good. They are not delivering good results. This is interesting. So I don't know why the MAGA movement supports Trump, but they don't support the Trumpist actors or networks, if you want to say that. So I guess we have in this year one opportunity to stop this growing erode of the political and judiciary system in America.
And so, a final point to you on this first section. Um, there's a lot of kind of discussion about this being unprecedented, that that hasn't happened. Then there's comparisons to what happened in Panama. But I want to put it to you that actually the US does seem to have a long history of nefarious involvements in countries around the globe. You look at the book The Killing Zone by Stephen G. Rabe, you look at Devil's Chessboard, you look at the Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins, and you see that whether it's kind of come from the president itself or from all the kind of other regulatory boards within America, the CIA especially, there's been a lot of involvement around the world as America has tried to police. And people have argued that it's mainly against socialist countries or countries that they just don't like the way that things are being run. So, is this moment actually that especially poignant in history, or is the theatre of it actually taking away from what is maybe just another American intervention in the South Americas, which happens oh so often?
I feel agree that we tend to exaggerate the weight of history. I mean, this is unique, never happened before. Okay, let me double check at least. It depends on how you count, but there's about 41 interventions of America in the Western Hemisphere. So it means that it's, let's say, frequent that America participate and intervene in internal and domestic issues. So why this time is different, or why this time is so relevant? Because we try to accept that there was a sort of international liberal order, which was not international, not liberal, no, not even an order, but at least there was a consensus after the Berlin Wall fall that we need some multilateral agreements. We are going to reject any domestic intervention, so we are not going to do this. And lastly, which is more important, we are not going to use violence to transform or to change the political regime. I guess this is not the first time that America intervened in one foreign country, but this time is the first time after this, let's say, post Cold War hegemonic consensus. So, and you know what? What is relevant for me? Okay, you can say that China did this or that, or Russia with Ukraine, or whatever. But America used to be the key for this liberal order. So if America is not interested in the liberal order, who is going to support that in terms of security, free trade, personal beliefs? I don't know. All what we used to call liberal order. You remember that, or are you so John, or what is that?
Yeah, no, no, it's something that I've actually written down to bring up a little bit later because I think there might have to be a philosophical rethinking of that. But before we do, I do want to get on to a second area of importance, and again, guided by your brilliant article. So this is the second key point. You've written about how Latin America now seems to be for the US Americans. You kind of use the old adage America for the Americans, but you put in Latin America for the US Americans. The ownership there now seems to be that this South American mega continent is now going to be the plaything of those up north. You believe that alongside Venezuela, there's pressure on Panama, Mexico, Cuba. And then I do want to ask about Canada and even Greenland with the things that have been said today, in the news. By the time this is edited out, this could be late news and there could be, a total change in what's happening in Greenland. We just don't know how fast or how slow these things will go out. But there's a suggestion of a broader hemispheric strategy. So, how coordinated do you think that this approach is? How coordinated do you think it's going to be over the next months or years? Is there a coherent doctrine, or is it a bit of opportunism that maybe Trump saw here with Venezuela, and maybe it can't be repeated in other places in South America and Greenland as well?
But by far, we don't know. I mean, it's impossible to predict Trumpist administration because he's changing his mind every day, every week, every month. But now, after the publication of the national strategy, now we know something about what is the thinking in Washington and how they see the Western Hemisphere. This is important. By I would say the last 20 years, Latin America was out of the conversation, was not part of the conversation. Maybe Mexico, Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala because of the migration issue, but nothing else. There's nothing specific for Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, whatever. But now the Western Hemisphere and Latin America is in the center of the strategy. I will say something. In the last century, we have this very famous Monroe Doctrine, which means, okay, we have to create America for the Americans, and we have to be, I would say, fraternal with in the neighborhood. We have to protect America from, I would say, Europe. So, to a certain extent, the Monroe Doctrine was the defensive one. So let's protect the hemisphere. But what we have now, after this Trump's corollary or whatever, which is a Mackilley renewed strategy, we have a more offensive, expansive, and I will say economic approach to the hemisphere. It means we have a single mission, which is going to connect territory, technology, access to raw materials, oil, of course, but more important, access to infrastructures and so on. So this Trump's corollary for Latin America is not the same, is not defensive, is offensive. It's okay, we have to use or to think in a hemispheric system, and we have to combine soft power, hard power, and let's say gunboat power. So this is why I think that's new. It's a completely different approach. It's a completely new approach to the Monroe Doctrine, which is not only about defensive and protecting, trying to reduce the capacity of China in Peru or in Argentina or Brazil. It's not only about reducing, it's also you have to go out. We have to expel China from this continent. And this raw materials and minerals and ports and consumers should go to the American economy. So this is why I think it's different and important. Let me complete with your second question. If you ask me if I think there's a coherent doctrine for America, I would say no. Trump has a clear idea or slogan, make America great again, or something like that, but there's no strategy. Do you know why? Because strategy means a current body of action and ideas. This is a traditional definition. So, and I don't know which one is the big strategy or the grand strategy for Latin America because it depends. It depends on the day. Can you be sure that Colombia is not going to be the next one? What do you think about Mexico? What is going to happen in Argentina? So we don't know. There's no currents. That provides Trump more power because he can transform his own strategy almost every day. So this is why we don't know very well what is going to happen in the coming weeks, starting with Greenland and maybe finishing in the Patagonia. But I don't know. By now, we have more uncertainty than radical truth.
I want to add an idea here. Have we entered a new hyper Cold War era? Because it seems like there's no space left for any non-alignment, no neutrality, or even, Venezuela is obviously a type of socialistic government, but you've got Cuba down there that is communist. Will every country in the South America hemisphere now need to either be super capitalist, totally America first, or they're under threat, and overtly, and also, as we know in history, covertly, there might be nefarious missions against them. Is this the reality that we're in now? Is that the new Cold War is played by Trump's rules in his sphere, or you're going to get taken out?
That's a fantastic question. In 2026, we are going to have five big elections in Colombia, in Brazil, in Haiti, in Peru, and I'm missing one. Okay, I will be back. So in Costa Rica. So if, as we can imagine, these five countries move to Trumpist positions, it means candidates supporting this type of America for the Americans, America for the Trumpist American. We are going to have a new decade completely oriented through this Cold War. What is happening right now? That in many countries, in Chile, in Argentina, for instance, they are pro-Trump, something like that, or even in Ecuador and in El Salvador. So if you have 10, 11 countries pro-Trump, and I will include later on Mexico in that list, hey, what is the plan for China? What can China do in the continent? What is the future of the huge investments in Chancay ports in Peru? What is going to happen uh, in these investments in the metro in Brazil, for instance, on infrastructures in Argentina? So it's something that is going to change. What do we know now, or what are my colleagues in Latin America saying? That Latin America is not interested in the to be is not interested in being in the middle of this great power competition again. Now it's not the URSS, it's China, but they prefer to sell soy to China and to buy apples and then to have a European passport. So they prefer not to be aligned, but I guess that Trump is not going to accept this position, at least in the big five countries. They will be pro Trump in one way or another.
And I guess if it is another way, like is it Lula in Brazil? He'll come under pressure, won't he? That will be the reality. Is there will be accusations maybe made up. That's what I envisage. I don't have prior information, but I can just kind of see the playbook already. If any sort of aggravator to the status quo comes in, then they're going to have so much pressure on them, not just from Trump, but from their neighbors. It's going to be almost impossible to try alternative, non neoliberal politics in South America for the near future, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. And it's very difficult to understand the strategy because when you listen to G.D. Vance and some other author, some other top politicians in Washington, they say, this is none of our business. We are not going to say nothing about Brazil. But at the end of the day, what you see is, okay, Trump is going to support the alternative candidate to Trump, to Lula, sorry, whatever the name, whatever the position, and he's saying something about something like this. Okay, if you're not voting my candidate, what we are going to do is to increase the tariffs. That happened in Argentina in October, late October. I can't remember right now the date. So it's a sort of interference in the internal and domestic issues of the countries, which is very, very difficult to be non-aligned. Very, very difficult to these candidates to be out of the conversation, if you want to say that. So for sure, they will have Trump will be in these elections, will be in the ballot, if you want to say that, and they are going to. He's going to be one of the big assets for one of the candidates. Which one? I don't know. But please remember that after Trump, we also have the money coming from Elon Musk and all these technopros interested in supporting these neoliberal approaches to economy, to energy, to climate change, to technology, and all this stuff. Everything right now is very, very well connected.
So let's turn it on to takeaway three, which I thought was really fascinating and kind of explaining that this is not just about oil. It's not just about resources, but it's again an overhaul in the way the world's capitalistic, or I don't know if we can call it that anymore,
Mm.
neo-feudal economic system is going forward. Because, you know, to be to give credit to Trump, which I don't want to at all, but at least he's been, I guess, a little bit more honest than previous presidents, where he said, "Yeah, this is about the oil." Most other presidents in history have kind of been like, "This is about security. We have to do this." Whereas Trump, I don't know if it's a slip of the tongue or whatever, but he's kind of said, "No, no, we're also in this for the oil as well." So
Mhm.
the intervention was due there to apparently the poor control of massive resources and seemingly but totally unfounded claims that Venezuela oil was being pumped to China, when in fact I think only 4% of China's oil comes from Venezuela, showing that there's not a lot of truth to it. But anyway, you argue this is not about resources, that this isn't oil in the Iraq war sense. It's instead about something that you've described as geoeconomics, control over energy markets, supply chains, and technological infrastructure. So, can you unpack this argument a little bit more just for people to understand?
Yes, of course. I think this is interesting because most of the time you say Venezuela means oil. I say, yes, of course. But you know what? In the last years, America is developing its own energy strategy, including oil, fracking, and gas. And this oil is not for the American market. It's not for that. It's not about, okay, America will need more energy, more oil, and maybe Venezuelan oil will increase or decrease the price for the American market, and we can develop the industrial agenda better and faster and cheaper. Okay, that's true. But if you open your mind and you look around, okay, who is going to buy this oil? Because what America needs is not to buy cheaper oil coming from Venezuela, but controlling the market. That means, okay, I need more, let's say, material security, industry, energy, and please remember, avoiding other actors to develop in energy markets or having access to cheaper prices. I mean, America right now decide if the barrel costs about $30 or $40, and maybe not today, but in the coming years. And using that tool, they can say to China, hey, I can sell all this oil to India and help them to develop faster the industry. Or Russia, if you don't follow my rules, your oil will cost zero, will be will yeah, will cost less than $20. So it doesn't make sense for you to extract oil and from Russia, because I have this Venezuelan oil and I can flood the market. So this is what is the Venezuelan oil is about. It's not about the quality of that oil, because for sure, and it depends on where you read these sources, America will need to invest about $20,000 million, maybe $100,000 million. It's not clear right now, but I mean, it's not something that is going to be worthy in the coming months.
Yeah.
But for the future, this oil supply will help to Trump administration to create this strategy about energy, technology, and trade.
Is this almost a way of Trump controlling or even usurping the kind of OPEC arrangement? Because we've seen in history the OPEC oil crises that have, taken over the world, and barrels of oil have gone over this price, and queues at our local kind of petrol stations, but obviously it filters into the cost of food, the cost of living, and all things like that. Is this now Trump's OPEC? Is this his way to bargain with the whole of the world and say, look, I can turn it really high, I can turn it really low, but you got
Oh.
to play ball.
Yeah, and if you add to this situation that Europe depends on oil and gas, hey, Europe is going to face a big crisis if we don't have access to cheaper prices. And maybe if you have a good connection, I mean, Washington, with Venezuela and with Saudi Arabia, hey, who else is going to sell oil to Europe? I don't know.
Mm.
There's no, because it's impossible to support the European demand only using the Qatar gas. It's impossible. So we have to develop, I don't know, nuclear power. Should we buy more American gas? Should we start doing fracking? I don't know. So if you want to point with your finger one one problem or one consequence, one direct consequences is this Venezuelan oil out of the market will weak still more Europe and all this strategic autonomy that we need.
One last question on this, but it links beautifully to kind of things that you've said already about the change in the new world order. Increasingly we see that resources are tied to security and technology. So does that now mean that democracy becomes secondary by default? Is there a way that countries can resist this trade-off that, oh, okay, we will sell you our oil, but we also have to hand a little bit of power? Because that seems to be the negotiation now, that you either play ball and that you have to have a de facto president of your country that supports Trump or supports Putin or supports China, or you try and run your country, you try and resist it, but there's going to be interference. It seems like the bully boys are now making the rules, and democracy is just going to fade into these blocks of pro-Trump, pro-Putin, pro-Xi Jinping, and maybe in the future, maybe Modi with India as well.
For sure. Well, the new American statecraft is about the convergence of energy, technology, and security. And you know what is the consequence? Democracy, rule of law, human rights, it's out of the conversation. It's not the priority. I will not say that this world is more authoritarian one, but what I will say is that, okay, geoeconomics is about technology and power. It's not about, okay, can we export democracy? I remember that debate in international relations. Can we export democracy? Is that good for the world that we support new democracies in Iraq 20 years ago? Is not so good. Is that interference or not? By now, all these movements, decisions that we are facing in the American economy are connecting technology, power, trade, security, and you can name it. Stargate project, receiving investments coming from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, all these golden share movements in the US Steel Nippon activities, all this patriotic capitalism. I read that in the Financial Times some years ago. Uh, it's everything is connected, and the political values are not right now part of the conversation. That is what it is.
Mm. So, section 4 of your 5 points, and I think this area is probably the most worrisome, and it links to exactly what you're saying: a total redefining of the rules-based order around the world. In your work, you draw on Carl Schmitt's idea of nomos to describe a world divided into spheres of influence, and we've kind of talked about this already. Um, so, how close are we now to this world? Are we already here? The United States, China, Russia, even Israel with the Middle East. Is this now going to be the future? And almost in a way, is it going to be America, the Americas, and maybe bits of Europe and the Middle East, especially through Israel, China, Asia, Russia, their own kind of spheres of influence, maybe Eastern Europe and things like that. And that's how the world is just going to play out, almost majorly dictatorial states saying, this is our sphere of influence. You don't mess with us. We don't mess with you. And we're just going to allow these things to get on. Is that the sad reality that we're moving towards?
The problem for us, I will say, European, liberal Europeans, or whatever you want to describe us, is that we are educated in a world based on rules and cooperation and diplomacy and things like that. This nomos of Carl Schmitt is it's a completely different one. What the German author thinks is, okay, if we divide the world, we are going to reduce the instability because the two or three big authors, China and the United States and Russia, of course, but Israel in the Mediterranean Sea, Turkey in that area, India in other side. Okay, why do we need to compete if we have this plurality of cause home, big areas of geography where you have trade, people, demography, consumption. It's not demography, it's consumption. We don't need wars because we can have agreements on the very basic foundation. This is quite similar to what the Trump administration's name transactional diplomacy. Okay, there's no values in this conversation. Or if you want to name it connected or link it to security, security as a service. So what is that? So if you pay more, you will receive more security. If you don't pay, remember the 5% for the NATO, by the way, we are not going here to provide security. This is a completely new and different world. The Schmittian nomos is not an authoritarian world, but it's one world not depending on liberal democracy, human rights, or public goods. So this is what I see right now in the world, and there's a lot of countries saying, "Okay, this is not so bad," because we can have agreements, and international law is so it's a mess. It's very, I don't want to attend this question of minorities or women or climate change. It's not my problem. I prefer to do it alone. For time ago, I called this era the era of Beijing consensus, which is economics and investments without politics. So, do you want infrastructures, energy, and trade? Here we are. I'm not going to ask you about how are you acting in your internal problems, in your domestic affairs, or how you're facing an internal problem. This is a world that many countries are really, or model, I mean, supporting and I will say um, developing.
Mm. And so, a final question for you on this section is, for the UK and Europe, do they now need to realize and plan around a reality that Trump's USA, much like China, Russia, they're only working for themselves now? And so instead of pandering to the ego of Trump and illegal activities, they need to plan on how they're going to stand on their own 2 feet. Because I've looked at all the kind of discussions in parliament and things like that, and there's a huge split within the governing Labour Party, but also among many MPs of different colours and backgrounds. Half of them are kind of saying we need to pacify Trump because we need to ensure our global security against the growing threat of Russia and China, and we need to help our friends in Ukraine. And then you had some other people, Jeremy Corbyn, for example, very vocal and saying, the more that you kind of play to Trump's book, the more power you give to him. The reality is that if you keep giving and giving and giving to a bully, it's never going to stop. So is that what Europe has to do now? Is kind of say, yes, we do stop. We maybe create our own army. We create our own network of military factories so that we're not reliant on the USA for armaments, that we're not reliant on any other country for our energy and things like that. And is that the way that the world needs to kind of start reviewing itself? Because Europe then almost becomes a sphere of its own influence of liberal democracy because it's not going to be protected by anybody else.
I mean, the problem for Europe is that we are not accepting that this is the new world. We are, you know, let's see if Trump is not going to do this or that. Let's see if China is not going to do this or that. And there's a lot of things that China and Russia and America are doing and hurting Europe. But there's a lot of things that Europe can do by themselves and we are not doing, starting with internal market, starting with the energy, security, banking, media. So there's a lot of sectors where Europe can develop an internal market, and we are, trying to avoid it just in case, because we prefer to renationalize some of these politics. We are again promoting these national champions instead of regional champions. We are not supporting European initiatives. We are more thinking in national frontiers for hot topics like migration, for instance, and we prefer to avoid the new reality. So I'm so sorry because I am pro-European. By myself, I write about it for the last 20 years, trying to support and trying to create more Europe, a more united Europe. And by now, in the last, I would say, last political leaders generation, what they see is they are reluctant to be more European, and they are more okay. We are European, but I prefer to have this golden share on energy or golden share on industrial policy. I don't know what is going to happen in France in the 2027 election, but right now, if France is not leading the European country, I mean, if the far right wins the presidential election, okay, probably we are going to see the end of the European Union, at least as we used to think it. So I think we are in a very serious moment. We have to promote internal markets, we have to promote European projects, and we have to look for new allies. Canada is there, Mexico is there, South Korea, Japan, Indonesia. There's a lot of countries which are not America that are still interested in free trade and the rule based order. So we have to wake up. Come on, let's do it.
I guess with section 5 of your analysis, Your kind of final key point is that perhaps the most sombering for European audiences is that there needs to be a total philosophical overhaul in the belief systems, because you suggest that ideals like democracy, the rule of law, free trade are losing influence because they're no longer backed by capacity. And that leads us towards a Hobbesian logic where authority replaces truth. So, can democratic norms survive in this world ordered by force?
I hope so. I hope so. But we have to read Hobbes again. So, auctoritas non veritas facet legem, which means something like authority and not the truth, is going to create the law. So, you mentioned some of the problems we have in democracy, and these problems, which are truth and which are there and are relevant, most of the time we prefer to avoid the solutions because, they cost votes, because we have to discuss about, okay, what is the future of the welfare state? What can we do in Europe? What is the problem with demographics? What can we do with immigration? Do we want to have more, less? How to integrate them? Where? In which countries? How can we do that? What is the impact of artificial intelligence in the jobs market? What are we going to do with the technological companies? Can we promote internal markets for this? Can we create a Google, something like that? And most of the time, this is not the European conversation. The European conversation is about minimum things, trying to avoid real transformations and avoiding to accept that there is let's say, a weakness in the European system. We have to accept it and we have to start working in solving the problems. Otherwise, all these people are going to vote far extreme wings. You can name it far right or far left, it doesn't matter, which are not interested in the European project, are more nationalistic again, more short-sighted oriented and not connected with the European project. So if we don't accept that in the neighborhood we have more Hobbesians than never, uh, you know, our project is going to disappear in the next generation for sure. So for sure. So we need to accept that, and we need to work on the real problems, factual problems we have. Is not There's no problem in accepting that we have a discussion about migration, about the cost of living, about housing, about jobs, about young generations incorporated to the job market, about losing capacities. So if democracy doesn't deliver good products and services, people is going to start to ask, okay, is there any other political project? Can we vote another thing? And this is starting to happen in many countries in Europe. It's not only in France with the far right, it's also in Sweden, maybe in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, in Poland, in Hungary. Hey, maybe it's happening now,
In the
and we are
UK,
not.
it's
And
happening
the
over
UK,
here.
yeah, yeah, in the UK, sorry to say that.
Yeah.
So it is what it is. So if you don't accept that you have to deliver good public policy, not only debate about public policies. You have to deliver.
Mm.
You have to transform the real life of the people. That's the mission we have in Europe right now.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree, and I think, for my own personal opinion here, the the major issue that we had is the kind of movement away from some social democratic values which built Europe post World War II. We had the Keynesian economic system, which was focused on growth, employment, giving people purpose. Creating in England they said creating New Jerusalem for the people. Creating a good country. And my I don't know if you agree or disagree with this, but the Reaganism, Thatcherism, monetarism experiment of rugged individualism and things like that, no such thing as society, is where we went wrong. And I see a lot of these issues coming from them. and then obviously into austerity and things like that. The fact, like you said there, that there's no material improvements for about 30, 40 years for a lot of people is why they're choosing these alternatives. And so we need to go back to our roots and say, well, what is the state for? Is the state for banking? Is it for growing the economy? Or is it for improving the lives of our people, which obviously will filter into growing the economy? But the
Mhm.
economy shouldn't be first. Money shouldn't be
Yeah,
first. Balancing the books, it is about improving the lives of people because otherwise, what is the point? What is the
yeah,
actual point of having a government and people and things like that? Life is for living. Humanity is about the humans. It's not about money. So I don't
yeah.
know if you agree with that one or.
More or less is what I mentioned or what I describe under this Beijing consensus issue, which means, okay, this question about politics, human rights, and so on, it's not that relevant. I will provide you services. I will provide you good hospitals and schools, and I will provide you good highways or whatever. You know, if you are not improving the quality of life of people, if you are not delivering, if you are not providing the opportunity to be a good citizen, whatever it means, hey, what is the role of politics? Why do you need politics?
Hmm.
This is what is happening. This is what China is promoting. And there's a lot of countries saying, hey, you know what? These authoritarian or liberal regimes are working better than democracy. Let's try that. Why do you need a parliamentary system or the free press or whatever? You don't need it. Let's provide to the strong man, because they are always men, strong capacities and strong hyper, I will say hyper presidential capacities, and they will solve all the problems. And this is happening on the left, on the right, on the north, on the south, in all the latitudes. And most of the time, we democracies, we prefer not to accept it
Yes,
and
yeah.
say, no, this is going to pass. No, this is not going to pass if you don't solve real problems, starting with housing and jobs.
I mean, I lay a lot of the issue back to Francis Fukuyama and saying, the end of history is with liberalism. We've solved
Mm.
everything. We don't need to improve things. And this kind of falsehood that, oh, well, it's everything to the kind of liberal mindset is it will pass because, the end of history is liberalism. It's kind of very similar to almost like the Marxist ideology of historical. I forget the word, but it's always going to end in communism. That is the
Mm.
fact. I've forgotten the phrasing, but anyway, for me, yeah, I think this is the reality: is that the liberal democracies around the world need to realize that they need to start offering people. Otherwise, like you said, they're going to start questioning and giving up democracy for what they feel is a better deal, but it's not at all. So the conclusion to you, Juan, finally, thinking as the historian that I am, and also from a political analyst position, do you believe that we're still in a contested moment where many futures are possible, or have we sadly entered an era now where Venezuela will be remembered as one of those moments like Sarajevo, 1914, that only later came to symbolize the start of a prolonged decline in global freedoms and democratic order? Where are we?
Oh, this is the question today. So we, we yes, I'm not sure what is going to happen in the coming days, weeks, or months, but I'm sure about this. This is the end of the globalization that we used to consider a heuristic of free trade, democracy, and cosmopolitan view. That world disappeared. That world, I don't know, ended in Venezuela. Maybe it ended in Kiev. I'm not sure. But what I see right now is another sort of political discourse, which is mostly illiberal. In China, there's no content about this, but also in America, in India, even in the European Union and the UK, in the United Kingdom, you have a sort of national populist discourse, which means, okay, we can do it alone. We don't need the multilateral system. We don't need diplomacy. We don't need nothing like that. But even if you check what is happening in tech and trade and economics, this is the same. There is a, okay, we don't need we don't need rules because we can compete alone and we don't need to follow any type of competition. So the best technology, the American one or the Chinese one, will be enough. And if you go to the security scenario, what I see right now compared to 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago is more instability. So of course you have this Western hemispheric approach, which is the topic of today. But what about the future of Israel and Gaza? What about Russia and Ukraine? What is going to happen with the two Koreas? And what is going to happen in Taiwan? All these scenarios are open and we don't know very well what is going to happen. What is the good solution, if we can say that? So it's better to have more stability in this Schmittian world of spheres of influence. Is that really good? Is that good for democracy? I'm not sure. But by now, what we see in this security and defense issue is that the entry ticket right now to have a voice in the international affairs is hard power and nukes and force and all this stuff. So it's a completely different world. I like to say that this is the 3D world, which means disorder, deregulation, and deglobalization. Maybe that will be my final take.
It's a hard one to hear for future generations. It doesn't seem positive, but what I will say is it has been brilliant to chat to you today, Professor Juan Manfredi. As I said to people, this is from your interview with the conversation where you gave amazing analysis, and that's why we followed the 5 rules or the 5 key takeaways, because it was a really interesting discussion point, and it was a real honor to have you on. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Soon be back.
Yes, we will have you again in the future, no doubt. We were talking about other ideas off air, so be excited for that. Juan will not be a Juan visitor, he'll be many visitor. But cheerio for now.